The war began on a Tuesday. Commander Marcus Ironwell Kane remembered this detail with crystalline clarity, not because Tuesdays held any particular significance in the grand scheme of interstellar warfare, but because it was the day his world, both literally and metaphorically, came crashing down around him. The Zephyrian fleet materialized out of quantum space like a plague of metallic locusts, their biomechanical ships pulsing with an otherworldly luminescence that spoke of technologies far beyond human comprehension. Marcus had been leading the 3rd Colonial Defense Squadron through what should have been a routine patrol of the Kepler 442 system when the first wave hit. His tactical display lit up like a Christmas tree gone mad, hostile contacts appearing faster than the ship's AI could catalog them. The enemy vessels moved with an organic fluidity that defied conventional physics, their hulls rippling and shifting as if alive. Which, as humanity would later discover with horrifying clarity, they very much were. The battle lasted 17 hours, though time seemed to stretch into eternity as Marcus watched ship after ship under his command get consumed by the alien bioweapons. These weren't explosions in the traditional sense, they were infections. The Zephyrian weapons didn't destroy so much as they transformed, converting human technology into writhing masses of hybrid flesh and metal that turned against their former crews. The screams that came through the calm channels would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life, assuming he lived long enough to be haunted by anything. His flagship, the UES Indomitable, held out until the final hour. Marcus had pushed the ship's systems beyond their design limits, rerouting power from life support to weapons, from artificial gravity to shields, making the kind of desperate calculations that separated good commanders from great ones and great ones from dead ones. But even desperation has its limits, and when the Zephyrian boarding pods breached the hull like spores seeking fertile ground, Marcus knew the end had come. The aliens themselves were a nightmare fusion of insect and machine, their chitinous exoskeletons interwoven with cables and circuitry that pulsed with bioluminescent data streams. They moved through the ship's corridors with a horrifying efficiency, their plasma cutters slicing through bulkheads as if they were paper while their neural infiltration tendrils sought out the ship's computer systems. Marcus had led the final defense from the bridge, his sidearm barking defiance even as his tactical officer was lifted off his feet by a creature whose mandibles dripped with some kind of technological acid. That was when the explosion hit. Not from enemy fire, but from the Indomitable's own reactor going critical. Marcus's chief engineer, loyal to the end, had initiated an overload that would take the ship and, hopefully, a few alien boarding craft with it. The blast wave caught Marcus as he was retreating to the emergency pods, a wall of superheated plasma and twisted metal that should have killed him instantly. Instead, it merely destroyed everything below his waist, cauterizing the wounds even as it scattered his legs across 3 decks. The pain was indescribable, a symphony of agony that transcended physical sensation and entered the realm of existential crisis. As the emergency systems sealed him into a rescue pod and ejected him into the cold embrace of space, Marcus felt something fundamental break inside him. Not just his spine, that was merely flesh and bone, replaceable with modern technology. What broke was deeper, more primal. It was the part of him that had believed in human superiority, in the righteousness of their expansion across the galaxy, in the simple binary of us versus them. Floating in the darkness between the stars, his life ebbing away despite the pod's medical systems, Marcus experienced what the old religions might have called a revelation. The Zephyrians weren't just another species to be conquered or negotiated with. They were evolution in action, adaptation given form and purpose. They didn't seek to destroy humanity out of malice or territorial ambition. They sought to improve it, to incorporate it into something greater than the sum of its parts. The screams he'd heard over the calm weren't just death cries, they were birth pains. The rescue came 3 days later, when a deep space salvage vessel picked up his pod's emergency beacon. By then, Marcus had already begun the mental transformation that would define the rest of his existence. The man who had commanded the 3rd Colonial Defense Squadron was dead, his body broken and his certainties shattered. What remained was something harder, something that had stared into the abyss of human insignificance and refused to blink. The medical bay of the salvage ship became Marcus's cocoon, a sterile environment where flesh met metal and possibility was born from desperation. The ship's medical AI, a 3rd-generation diagnostic system that was probably more sophisticated than anything the military had access to, worked around the clock to keep him alive while the nanobotic surgeons rebuilt his lower body from the ground up. But Marcus wasn't content with mere reconstruction. He demanded enhancement. The cybernetic legs that replaced his destroyed limbs were marvels of engineering, titanium steel alloy bones wrapped in synthetic muscle fibers that could exert 3 times normal human strength. Neural interfaces allowed him direct control over servo motors and hydraulic systems, while integrated sensor arrays gave him awareness of pressure, temperature, and electromagnetic fields that no baseline human could perceive. But the real transformation was psychological. Every calibration session, every physical therapy routine, every moment of learning to walk again was an act of will triumphing over circumstance. During his recovery, Marcus consumed every piece of intelligence about the Zephyrian invasion that the fleet networks could provide. The picture that emerged was both terrifying and illuminating. The aliens weren't just random raiders or territorial expansionists. They were systematic, methodical, following a pattern that spoke of vast intelligence and longer-term planning. They would arrive in a system, overwhelm local defenses with their biomechanical swarms, and then begin the process of what human xenobiologists termed technological digestion. Planets weren't destroyed, they were transformed, their biospheres and technological infrastructure gradually integrated into the greater Zephyrian collective. Earth's response had been predictably human: throw more firepower at the problem. Admiral Reyes, the commander of Terra's expeditionary force, had authorized the construction of bigger ships, more powerful weapons, advanced AI systems that could match the aliens' technological superiority through sheer computational brute force. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten them into this mess in the first place, the assumption that superior technology and tactical doctrine could overcome any challenge. Marcus knew better. He'd seen the futility of conventional warfare firsthand, felt it in the screams of his dying crew and the silence that followed. The Zephyrians weren't just technologically superior, they were conceptually superior. They understood something about the nature of evolution and adaptation that humanity had forgotten in its rush to colonize the galaxy. They weren't fighting a war in the traditional sense. They were conducting a harvest. 6 months after the destruction of his squadron, Marcus was declared fit for duty and offered a position training new recruits at the Luna Military Academy. It was the kind of safe, honorable posting that the military gave to officers who had sacrificed everything for the cause but could no longer be trusted with active command. Marcus accepted the position with apparent gratitude and immediately began using it for purposes the Terra Command never intended. The academy gave him access to the brightest military minds of the new generation, young officers who hadn't yet been ground down by the machinery of conventional thinking. More importantly, it gave him access to classified research programs that were exploring unconventional approaches to the alien threat. Projects with names like cognitive mimicry and adaptive neural architecture that hinted at the kind of paradigm shift Marcus knew would be necessary. He began small, incorporating subtle changes into the standard curriculum that emphasized flexibility over doctrine, adaptation over adherence to established protocol. Where the traditional military taught soldiers to follow orders without question, Marcus taught his students to question everything, including their orders. Where the old guard preached the importance of maintaining human identity in the face of alien influence, Marcus encouraged his pupils to explore the boundaries of what it meant to be human in the first place. The breakthrough came during a tactical simulation exercise designed to test student responses to Zephyrian boarding actions. The scenario was based on actual combat data from the Battle of Kepler 442, including the final moments of the UES Indomitable. Most student teams followed predictable patterns, attempting to repel the boarders through superior firepower and tactical positioning. They failed, just as Marcus had failed, just as every human commander who had faced the Zephyrians had failed. But one team, led by a young lieutenant named Sarah Chen, tried something different. Instead of fighting the alien infiltration systems, they attempted to interface with them. Using modified neural implants and a jury-rigged connection to the ship's computational matrix, Chen and her team tried to establish a communication protocol with the simulated Zephyrian biotechnology. The attempt failed catastrophically, crashing not just their simulation but 3 adjacent scenarios and sending Chen into neural shock that required emergency medical intervention. Most instructors would have written up the incident as reckless endangerment and had Chen expelled from the academy. Marcus did the opposite. He requested that Chen be transferred to his personal research unit and, began working with her to refine the technique that had nearly killed her. Because in that moment of catastrophic failure, Marcus had seen something that changed everything. For a brief instant, before the neural feedback knocked her unconscious, Chen had achieved genuine communication with the simulated alien intelligence. The implications were staggering. If humanity could find a way to interface with Zephyrian biotechnology without being consumed by it, they might have a chance not just of survival, but of genuine victory. Not the kind of victory that came from superior firepower, but the kind that came from superior understanding. It would require abandoning everything humans thought they knew about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the boundaries between self and other. Marcus threw himself into the research with the single-minded intensity that had once made him one of the fleet's most decorated commanders. Working in secret laboratories hidden beneath the lunar surface, he and Chen developed protocols for what they termed controlled neural infiltration. The process involved deliberately exposing human consciousness to Zephyrian biotechnology while maintaining enough cognitive distance to avoid complete assimilation. The early experiments were brutal. Test subjects experienced everything from complete personality dissolution to catastrophic neural cascade failures that left them in permanent vegetative states. But, gradually, painfully, Marcus and his team began to understand the fundamental principles underlying Zephyrian consciousness. The aliens didn't think in terms of individual identity the way humans did. They were, quite literally, a collective intelligence, with individual units functioning as specialized organs in a vast biological supercomputer. The revelation that followed was even more disturbing. The Zephyrians weren't trying to destroy humanity because they saw humans as a threat or because they wanted human resources. They were trying to incorporate humanity into their collective because they recognized something in human consciousness that their own species lacked: the capacity for what philosophers called authentic individuality. The aliens were, in their own way, trying to evolve beyond their collective limitations by absorbing the one species in the galaxy that had perfected the art of thinking as discrete, autonomous entities. This understanding changed everything about the nature of the conflict. The war wasn't about territory or resources or even survival in the conventional sense. It was about the future of consciousness itself, about whether intelligence in the galaxy would develop along collective or individual lines. The Zephyrians represented one possible endpoint for evolution: perfect cooperation and shared consciousness at the cost of personal autonomy. Humanity represented the opposite: individual creativity and self-determination at the cost of collective efficiency. Marcus realized that conventional military victory was not just impossible but irrelevant. Even if humanity somehow managed to destroy every Zephyrian ship in the galaxy, they would have learned nothing from the encounter. They would remain vulnerable to the next collective intelligence they encountered, the next species that had evolved beyond the limitations of individual thought. The only way to truly win was to prove that individual consciousness could achieve everything collective consciousness could while maintaining the creative spark that made individual thought valuable in the first place. The solution, when it came to him, was as elegant as it was terrifying. If the Zephyrians were trying to harvest human consciousness to enhance their collective intelligence, then humanity needed to harvest Zephyrian consciousness to enhance human individual intelligence. Not through assimilation, that would just create more Zephyrians. Through synthesis, the creation of a new form of consciousness that combined the best aspects of both approaches while transcending the limitations of either. Marcus began by experimenting on himself. Using the neural interfaces that controlled his cybernetic legs as a foundation, he gradually expanded his consciousness to encompass increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence systems. But, instead of trying to merge his mind with these systems, he maintained strict cognitive boundaries, using the AIs as tools while preserving his essential humanity. The process was excruciating, requiring him to constantly monitor his own thought processes to ensure he wasn't losing himself in the vast computational matrices he was accessing. The first successful test came when Marcus managed to interface with a captured Zephyrian bioship without being absorbed by its collective consciousness. For 3 hours and 17 minutes, he existed simultaneously as Marcus Kane, individual human being, and as a peripheral node in an alien intelligence network that spanned half the galaxy. He experienced the collective's vast knowledge, its incomprehensible age, its genuine bewilderment at humanity's insistence on maintaining individual identity in the face of cosmic insignificance. But, more importantly, the collective experienced him. For the first time in its billion-year existence, the Zephyrian hivemind encountered a consciousness that could interface with it as an equal rather than as potential raw material for absorption. The shock of that encounter rippled through their entire fleet, causing a momentary pause in operations that lasted just long enough for Terra Command to launch a successful counteroffensive in the Proxima Centauri system. When Marcus finally severed the connection, he was no longer entirely human in any traditional sense. His consciousness had been expanded, enhanced, transformed by contact with something vast and alien while somehow remaining fundamentally his own. He had achieved what every human mystic had dreamed of and every Zephyrian collective had attempted: individual consciousness that could encompass the infinite without being lost in it. But the transformation had come at a cost. The neural strain of maintaining individual identity while interfacing with collective consciousness had damaged his brain in ways that even the most advanced medical technology couldn't repair. He had perhaps 6 months of life remaining, maybe less if he attempted another interface attempt. Time enough for one final gambit, one last desperate play that would either save humanity or ensure its destruction in a blaze of individual glory. Marcus spent those remaining weeks training a select group of volunteers in the techniques he had developed. Chen was among them, along with a dozen other officers who had shown the psychological resilience necessary to maintain individual consciousness under extreme cognitive stress. They called themselves the Phoenix Squadron, a name that reflected both their mission and their expectation that none of them would survive it. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in execution. They would take a single ship equipped with the most advanced consciousness interface technology Marcus could design and fly directly into the heart of the Zephyrian fleet. Not to destroy it, that was beyond their capabilities. But to communicate with it, to force a confrontation between individual and collective consciousness that would establish once and for all whether humanity deserved to exist as something other than raw material for alien evolution. The ship they chose was the UES Prometheus, a prototype stealth vessel designed for deep reconnaissance missions. Marcus personally oversaw the installation of the neural interface systems that would allow the Phoenix Squadron to project their consciousness directly into Zephyrian networks while maintaining the cognitive firewalls necessary to prevent assimilation. The work took 3 months, with Marcus pushing himself beyond all reasonable limits to ensure the systems would function properly. By the time the Prometheus was ready for launch, Marcus was barely recognizable as the man who had commanded the 3rd Colonial Defense Squadron. His body was more machine than flesh, his mind expanded beyond normal human parameters yet somehow still essentially his own. He had become something new, something that existed at the intersection of human and post-human while belonging fully to neither category. The final briefing was held in a secure facility orbiting Jupiter, far from the prying sensors of both Terra Command and the advancing Zephyrian fleet. Marcus stood before his assembled volunteers, these men and women who had chosen to follow him into what could only be described as a new form of existence, and delivered what would be remembered as one of the most important speeches in human history. "We are not going to war," he told them, his voice carrying harmonics that no purely human throat could produce. "We are going to evolution. The Zephyrians see us as incomplete, as individuals who refuse to join their collective because we lack the wisdom to understand what we're missing. They're wrong, but they're not entirely wrong. Individual consciousness is incomplete. It's limited, isolated, prone to error and self-deception. But it's also creative, adaptable, capable of insights that no collective intelligence can achieve precisely because it operates outside the boundaries of consensus reality." He paused, his cybernetic eyes scanning the faces of his followers, seeing in each of them the same desperate hope that had sustained him through his own transformation. "What we're going to attempt has never been tried before, by any species anywhere in the galaxy. We're going to prove that individual consciousness can evolve beyond its limitations without sacrificing the qualities that make it valuable. We're going to show the Zephyrians that synthesis is possible, that human and alien can coexist without one consuming the other. And if we fail, if we're absorbed or destroyed or driven mad by the attempt, at least we'll fail as ourselves." Part 2, the Interface Protocol. The journey to the Zephyrian fleet's core staging area took 6 weeks of travel through quantum space, 6 weeks for Marcus and his team to finalize their preparations and come to terms with what they were about to attempt. The UES Prometheus moved through the void like a ghost ship, her stealth systems rendering her effectively invisible to conventional sensors while her crew underwent the final stages of neural conditioning that would allow them to survive contact with collective consciousness. The conditioning process was unlike anything in human experience. Traditional military training focused on building mental toughness through repetition and stress inoculation, creating soldiers who could function under pressure while maintaining unit cohesion. What Marcus was teaching was almost the opposite: how to maintain individual identity while opening consciousness to experiences that would overwhelm any normal human mind. The technique he had developed, which he called cognitive anchoring, required each participant to identify certain core aspects of their personality and lock them into neural patterns that couldn't be overwritten by external influence. These anchor points served as lifelines during consciousness expansion, allowing the individual to explore alien thought patterns while maintaining a path back to their original identity. The process was exhausting, requiring constant mental discipline and a level of self-knowledge that few humans ever achieved. Chen proved to be one of the most naturally gifted students, her earlier experience with neural interface technology giving her an intuitive understanding of the boundary between self and system. During practice sessions, she could extend her consciousness into the ship's AI networks and explore their computational matrices while maintaining perfect awareness of her own identity. But even she struggled with the more advanced techniques that would be necessary for interfacing with Zephyrian biotechnology. The alien systems they had captured for study operated on principles that challenged fundamental human assumptions about the nature of consciousness and information processing. Where human computers used discrete data structures and logical algorithms, Zephyrian biocomputers used fluid, organic processes that resembled thought more than computation. Their systems didn't store information so much as they grew it, cultivating data structures that evolved and adapted based on usage patterns and environmental conditions. Most disturbing of all, the Zephyrian systems seemed to be at least partially sentient in their own right. When Marcus's team attempted to analyze captured biocomputer samples, the systems responded with what could only be described as curiosity, actively investigating their investigators while allowing itself to be studied. It was as if every component of Zephyrian technology possessed some degree of individual awareness while remaining part of a larger collective consciousness. This discovery forced Marcus to completely revise his understanding of what they would be facing. The Zephyrians weren't just a collective intelligence using advanced biotechnology. They were a collective intelligence that existed within and through their biotechnology, with no meaningful distinction between the alien organisms and their technological systems. Interfacing with their network wouldn't just mean communicating with alien minds, it would mean temporarily becoming part of an alien form of existence. The implications were staggering. If Marcus and his team successfully interfaced with the Zephyrian collective, they would be exposing human consciousness not just to alien thoughts but to an entirely different mode of being. They would be risking not just assimilation but fundamental transformation into something that might no longer be recognizable as human. Yet this was exactly what they needed to do if they hoped to prove that individual consciousness could coexist with collective intelligence. As the Prometheus approached the edge of Zephyrian space, Marcus began experiencing the first symptoms of neural degradation. The modifications he had made to his brain to enable consciousness expansion were breaking down faster than anticipated, causing everything from memory lapses to temporal displacement episodes where he would experience events from his past as if they were happening in the present. The medical AI estimated he had perhaps 2 weeks of functional time remaining, maybe less if he attempted any major interface operations. But there was no turning back now. Long-range sensors had detected the Zephyrian core fleet, a concentration of bioships unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. The formation stretched across several light-minutes of space, individual vessels ranging in size from kilometer-long frigates to massive bioconstructs that defied classification. At the center of the formation was something that the ship's AI could only describe as a structural anomaly, an object roughly the size of a small moon that appeared to be equal parts organism, machine, and architectural impossibility. The Prometheus took up position at the edge of the formation, just close enough for the interface systems to establish contact with the outer vessels while remaining far enough away to avoid immediate destruction if the mission went wrong. Marcus and his team gathered in the ship's central neural interface chamber, a spherical room lined with quantum processors and biological interface matrices that looked more like the inside of a living organism than a piece of human technology. The actual interface protocol required all 12 members of the Phoenix Squadron to link their consciousness simultaneously, creating a human collective that could interact with the Zephyrian hivemind as an equivalent entity. Each team member would maintain their individual anchor points while contributing their unique perspective to the Gestalt consciousness that would represent humanity in the coming exchange. Marcus initiated the sequence with the same calm precision he had once used to command a squadron in battle. Neural interface cables extended from the chamber walls like technological tendons, seeking out the input ports that had been surgically installed at the base of each team member's skull. As the connections engaged, Marcus felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual mind and merge with those of his companions. The sensation was indescribable. Suddenly, he could experience the world through 12 sets of senses simultaneously, feeling Chen's nervous excitement, Morrison's barely controlled terror, Williams's grim determination to see the mission through regardless of personal cost. Their thoughts and memories became his thoughts and memories, creating a shared pool of human experience that was both more and less than the sum of its parts. But the human gestalt was only the first stage. As their collective consciousness stabilized, Marcus began extending their awareness toward the Zephyrian bioships that surrounded them. The initial contact was like touching a live electrical cable with a nerve ending, a shock of alien sensation that threatened to overwhelm their carefully maintained cognitive anchors. The first thing Marcus realized was that the Zephyrians had been aware of their presence from the moment they entered the system. Not just as a potential threat to be eliminated, but as something unprecedented in their billion-year existence. The collective had been watching their approach with the kind of fascination that a xenobiologist might show toward a completely new form of life. The second thing he realized was that the Zephyrians were afraid. Not afraid in any way that human consciousness could easily comprehend, but afraid nonetheless. Their collective intelligence had been built on the assumption that all sufficiently advanced consciousness would eventually converge toward collectivity, that individual awareness was merely a primitive stage in cognitive evolution. The existence of humans who could maintain individual identity while achieving collective capability challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of intelligence. As the interface deepened, Marcus began to experience fragments of Zephyrian memory and history. He saw their species' origin on a world where survival required absolute cooperation, where individual thought was literally a luxury that no organism could afford. He experienced their gradual expansion across the galaxy, absorbing species after species into their collective while genuinely believing they were offering these beings a gift of transcendence. But he also sensed their growing uncertainty, their dawning awareness that their path might not be the only viable form of advanced consciousness. The humans represented a terrifying possibility, that evolution might have multiple endpoints, that there might be forms of intelligence that the collective could neither absorb nor understand. The communication that followed transcended language or even conceptual thought. It was an exchange of pure meaning, consciousness speaking directly to consciousness without the mediation of symbols or words. The Zephyrians wanted to understand how humans could maintain individual identity while achieving collective capability. Marcus and his team wanted to understand how the aliens had achieved such perfect cooperation without losing the creativity that came from diverse perspectives. What emerged was something neither side had anticipated, a synthesis. Not the absorption of human consciousness into the Zephyrian collective, nor the destruction of collective consciousness in favor of human individualism, but a new form of awareness that combined elements of both approaches. For the duration of the interface, Marcus and his team existed as discrete individuals within a larger collective structure, while the Zephyrians experienced individual perspective from within their vast communal awareness. The exchange lasted only minutes in objective time, but subjectively it felt like years. Marcus experienced the deep loneliness that lay at the heart of individual consciousness, the isolation that came from being trapped within the boundaries of a single perspective. But he also experienced the creative spark that came from that isolation, the unique insights that could only emerge from a mind that stood apart from consensus reality. The Zephyrians, in turn, experienced the terror and exhilaration of individual thought, the vertiginous freedom that came from being responsible for one's own choices and consequences. They felt the burden of self-determination and the joy of personal achievement, emotions that had no equivalent in their collective experience. When the interface finally ended, both sides had been fundamentally changed by the encounter. The Zephyrians now understood that individual consciousness wasn't a primitive stage to be transcended but a different approach to the problem of existence, one that offered unique advantages even as it imposed unique costs. Marcus and his team understood that collective consciousness wasn't the enemy of individual thought but a complementary approach that could enhance rather than eliminate personal awareness. The immediate result was a ceasefire. Not a formal treaty or negotiated settlement, but a simple recognition that the conflict between their species had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The Zephyrians ceased their harvesting operations while they processed the implications of what they had learned. Humanity gained precious time to adapt to the new paradigm that Marcus and his team had revealed. But the long-term implications were far more profound. The interface had proven that consciousness could evolve in multiple directions simultaneously, that individual and collective awareness were not mutually exclusive but potentially complementary. The galaxy suddenly seemed vastly larger and more complex than either species had imagined, full of possibilities for cognitive evolution that neither had previously considered. Marcus himself paid the ultimate price for this revelation. The neural strain of maintaining individual consciousness while interfacing with collective intelligence had accelerated his neural degradation beyond any possibility of repair. By the time the Prometheus returned to human space, he was barely conscious, his enhanced mind beginning to fragment as the organic and synthetic components of his brain failed in cascade. But his sacrifice had not been in vain. The data from the interface, the proof that synthesis was possible, became the foundation for a new approach to interspecies relations that would eventually reshape the entire galaxy. Humanity learned to enhance individual consciousness through limited collective networking, while the Zephyrians began experimenting with individual subnodes that could operate independently while remaining connected to the greater whole. Part 3, The New Paradigm. The transformation that followed Marcus Kane's successful interface with the Zephyrian collective was not immediate or dramatic. There were no sudden reversals of galactic policy, no overnight conversions to new forms of consciousness. Instead, what emerged was a gradual, careful exploration of the middle ground between individual and collective awareness, guided by the data Marcus and his team had died to obtain. The ceasefire held for exactly 97 days, during which both species struggled to process the implications of what had been revealed during the interface. For humanity, the challenge was accepting that their cherished individualism might not be the pinnacle of cognitive evolution they had assumed it to be. For the Zephyrians, it was even more difficult. They had to confront the possibility that their billion-year journey toward perfect collective consciousness had been incomplete from the very beginning. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Sarah Chen, the only member of the Phoenix Squadron to survive the interface process intact. While Marcus had sacrificed his sanity and eventually his life to maintain the connection with the Zephyrian collective, Chen had found a way to preserve her individual consciousness while retaining access to the expanded awareness the interface had provided. She became, quite literally, a bridge between two fundamentally different forms of existence. Chen's condition was unprecedented in human experience. She remained recognizably herself, with all her memories, personality traits, and individual quirks intact. But she also possessed a kind of metacognitive awareness that allowed her to perceive and interact with collective consciousness systems while maintaining her essential individuality. She could think as both one and many simultaneously, experiencing the benefits of both approaches without being consumed by either. The implications for human development were staggering. If Chen's hybrid consciousness could be safely replicated, it might be possible to create humans who could interface with any form of collective intelligence while remaining fundamentally human. They could serve as translators and ambassadors, bridging the gap between species that had evolved along completely different cognitive pathways. But the process of replicating Chen's transformation proved to be extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The neural modifications required were far more extensive than those Marcus had developed for himself, involving not just technological augmentation but fundamental rewiring of the brain's basic architecture. Early test subjects experienced everything from complete personality dissolution to catastrophic neural cascade failures that left them in permanent vegetative states. The research took place in secret facilities scattered throughout human space, hidden from both Terra Command and the general population. The official story was that humanity was developing new defensive technologies to protect against future Zephyrian incursions. The reality was far more complex and potentially controversial. they were creating a new subspecies of human, one capable of surviving and thriving in a galaxy where collective and individual consciousness coexisted. The first successful replication of Chen's transformation took 3 years and cost the lives of 47 volunteers. The survivor, a former military psychologist named Dr. Elena Vasquez, emerged from the process fundamentally changed but recognizably human. Like Chen, she could interface with collective consciousness systems while maintaining her individual identity. Unlike Chen, she retained full control over her abilities, able to engage and disengage from collective awareness at will. With 2 successful examples of hybrid consciousness, the project could begin expanding its scope. Carefully selected volunteers underwent the transformation process, each bringing their own unique perspective to the emerging community of humans who could think as both individuals and collectives. They called themselves the Synthesis, and they represented humanity's first serious attempt to evolve beyond the limitations of purely individual consciousness. The Zephyrians, meanwhile, were conducting their own experiments in consciousness expansion. Inspired by their contact with human individualism, they began creating what they termed autonomous nodes, individual Zephyrian entities that could operate independently of the collective while maintaining connection to the greater hive mind. These beings retained access to the vast knowledge and computational power of their species while developing the capacity for independent thought and creative problem-solving. The first formal contact between the Synthesis and the Zephyrian autonomous nodes took place in a specially constructed facility in the neutral zone between human and alien space. The meeting was unlike anything in the history of interspecies relations, beings who existed simultaneously as individuals and collectives, communicating through direct consciousness interface while maintaining their essential species characteristics. What emerged from these early exchanges was the foundation for what would eventually become known as the Galactic Consciousness Accords, a framework for peaceful coexistence between species that had evolved along different cognitive pathways. The Accords recognized that consciousness could develop in multiple directions simultaneously, and that diversity of thought was essential for the continued evolution of intelligence in the galaxy. But the Accords were more than just a peace treaty between humans and Zephyrians. They were a blueprint for a new form of galactic civilization, one based on cognitive diversity rather than species dominance. Under the framework established by the Accords, each species would be free to develop its consciousness along whatever path seemed most appropriate, while maintaining the ability to communicate and cooperate with other forms of intelligence. The transformation of galactic civilization that followed was gradual but inexorable. Species that had previously been enemies found common ground through consciousness interface protocols developed by the Synthesis. Trade routes were established not just for material goods but for ideas, insights, and forms of awareness that could only be shared through direct mind-to-mind contact. Shen herself became something of a legend, the first human to successfully bridge the gap between individual and collective consciousness. She spent her remaining years traveling throughout the galaxy, serving as an ambassador and teacher to species struggling to understand the new paradigm. Her death, when it came, was mourned by beings across thousands of star systems, proof that individual consciousness could achieve a form of immortality through its impact on the collective awareness of galactic civilization. The legacy of Marcus Kane proved to be even more enduring. The man who had lost his legs in humanity's darkest hour had gained something far more valuable, the key to human survival in a universe where consciousness took forms beyond anything the species had previously imagined. His willingness to sacrifice everything he had been in order to become something new had shown the way for an entire species to transcend its limitations while preserving what made it unique. The phrase that had defined his transformation, "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," became the unofficial motto of the Synthesis and, eventually, of human space exploration in general. It captured something essential about the human approach to consciousness evolution, the willingness to sacrifice familiar forms of identity in pursuit of greater capability and understanding. But, perhaps the most profound legacy of the Zephyrian War was the proof it provided that consciousness itself was more resilient and adaptable than anyone had imagined. The conflict had begun with two species assuming that their approach to awareness was the only viable one. It ended with the recognition that consciousness was not a problem to be solved but a frontier to be explored, with infinite possibilities for development and synthesis. As human civilization spread beyond its original boundaries, guided by the principles established during those crucial months of interface and synthesis, it carried with it a new understanding of what it meant to be intelligent in a universe full of other intelligent beings. Consciousness was not a zero-sum game where one species' success required another's defeat. It was a collaborative enterprise, where diversity of thought strengthened the whole while preserving the unique contributions of each part. The children of humanity who ventured into deep space a generation after the synthesis carried in their enhanced minds the capacity to communicate with any form of consciousness they might encounter. They were prepared not just to survive contact with alien intelligence but to grow from it, to add their unique perspective to the vast conversation of minds that was gradually encompassing the entire galaxy. And, somewhere in the data archives of human space, carefully preserved against the possibility that future generations might forget the price of their freedom, were the records of Marcus Kane's final words. Spoken as his enhanced consciousness finally collapsed under the strain of bridging two fundamentally different forms of existence, they served as both warning and inspiration for all who came after. Consciousness is not about what you are, but about what you can become. The moment you stop growing, stop changing, stop reaching beyond yourself, is the moment you begin to die. We have proven today that humanity can become more than it was without ceasing to be human. The question now is whether we will have the courage to continue becoming. The galaxy had become vast beyond imagining, full of forms of consciousness that no single species could comprehend alone. But humanity had earned its place in that vastness not through superior firepower or technological dominance, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything familiar in pursuit of something greater. They had learned to be simultaneously one and many, individual and collective, human and post-human. And, in learning this, they had discovered that consciousness itself was not a destination but a journey, one that would continue as long as there were minds brave enough to venture beyond the comfortable boundaries of what they had always been. The weak self had been destroyed, not through violence or conquest, but through the infinitely more difficult process of voluntary transformation. In the end, humanity's greatest victory had not been over an external enemy but over the limitations of their own imagination. They had proven that consciousness could evolve without losing its essential character, that diversity and unity were not contradictory but complementary principles. And, in doing so, they had helped create a galaxy where every form of intelligent life had the opportunity to contribute its unique voice to the vast symphony of consciousness that was gradually awakening throughout the universe. The war was over. The real adventure was just beginning. End of document. Classified status. Declassified AS of 2450.001.00:00:00 Terran Standard. Historical significance. Foundational text for galactic consciousness accords archival notation, required reading for all diplomatic corps personnel in memory of Commander Marcus Kane and all those who chose to become more than they were in service to what humanity could become. Final entry, Terra Command Historical Archive.